Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Sustainability and Circularity in the Textiles Value Chain. I'm Hannes McNulty, and as Senior Green Industry Advisor, I lead GGKP's Green Industry Platform, which was launched in 2019. We're really very happy to have you with us today, and of course, hope that you are healthy and safe. The GGKP is glad to host today's webinar, which will launch a new UN Environment Programme report called Sustainability and Circularity in the Textile Value Chain, Global Stocktaking. This report investigates the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of the global textiles industry and spotlights priority actions for a rapid shift to circularity in textile value chains. Now, for this webinar, we're very fortunate to be joined by experts from the global fashion industry, China's National Textile and Apparel Council, the MacArthur Foundation, Fashionomics Africa, the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency, and of course, the UN Environment Programme. I'd like to also take the opportunity to let you know about another upcoming webinar on November 2nd, which will be the next session in our Rebuilding Better webinar series. It's called Rebuilding Better, the Role of Training and Education. That webinar will discuss the role of education and learning in a successful long-term recovery, and will also introduce the Green Learning Network, which is a collaborative space where education and training professionals can share and access green learning resources and events and collaborate and learn from each other. You can register for this upcoming Rebuilding webinar on ggkp.org/rebuildingbetter_education. And if you're actually not already familiar with the GGKP, I'd encourage you to also visit our web platforms and join the growing community at ggkp.org/subscribe. During today's webinar, we will really welcome comments and questions through the questions box. And this is something I'd really encourage you to actively use, as it's a fantastic opportunity to engage directly with the panel of experts, pose your questions, and so on. After the webinar itself, we then also appreciate it if you take a few minutes to complete a short survey. At the end of the day, it's feedback like yours that help us shape our future webinars and make them better every time. Please note as well that a full recording of the webinar will be available on our website at ggkp.org. Now, just before we get started on today's webinar, I'd like to take a moment to introduce you to the Global Opportunities for Sustainable Development Goals, or Go4SDGs initiative, which was launched by the UN Environment Programme and partners in 2019. Go4SDGs will share innovative practices for greener economies and sustainable production and consumption that can be taken to scale. Importantly, Go4SDGs also offers access to a range of tools and services offered by Go4SDG partners through a recently launched menu of services. For example, Go4SDGs offers a range of services for policymakers, businesses, and youth to support the transition from a linear to a circular model of resource use. And these include the World Economic Forum Scale 360 partnership, which supports bottom-up innovation to fast-track the fourth industrial revolution technology impact in the circular economy, including in the fashion sector. The One Planet Product Sustainability Information Hub, which provides consumer information for sustainable consumption and guidelines for providing product sustainability information. We have the Lifecycle Initiative's Lifecycle Thinking e-learning modules for business and policy decision-making. The Seed Practitioner Labs for policy prototyping, which brings together policymakers, eco-inclusive enterprises, and other relevant stakeholders, such as enterprise support organizations, networks, and financial institutions, to design policy instruments. Now, more information on Go4SDGs and all of these services I've just mentioned is available at go4sdgs.org. So, coming back to today's webinar, and without much further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Laila Petrie, textiles expert consultant at the UN Environment Programme, CEO of 2050, and Vice Chair of the UNFCCC Fashion Industry Charter for Climate Action. Laila, I'm really delighted to welcome you to today's webinar and hereby turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Hannes, and a very warm welcome to everybody watching and on the line. So I think today's session is going to be really exciting. We're launching the report, as you heard, the Sustainability and Circularity in the Textile Value Chain Global Stocktaking. But we will also be exploring some of the themes of the report with a panel of fantastic experts. So I think what we're going to do is it's going to give us an opportunity to dive into some of the thematic areas of the report. So what does circularity and sustainability really mean for the fashion industry? What are the key impacts and challenges that we need to keep in mind and need to address inside the industry? And also, what is the strategic direction and how does it build on the existing work of others? So we have some very, very competent and experienced panelists with us today who can talk about their existing work with circularity and how it can relate to the global industry approach for circularity. This will also be the first in a series of actions by UNEP. So I am working with UNEP very excitingly to have follow-up analysis on a roadmap around circularity for the industry. So more events and reports to follow. So what I'd like to first of all do is turn to the UNEP team who are in charge of this whole piece. So Elisa Tonda, who's the head of the Consumption and Production Unit for UNEP, and Bettina, who is the coordinator of the textiles work and the framework lead on the reports. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much, Laila, and allow me to add my words to yours in welcoming everybody to the webinar, and thank all the participants for having decided to invest some time today with us to discuss the findings of the newly released report, Sustainability and Circularity in the Textile Value Chain, Global Stocktaking. But prior to entering into the details of the report, allow me to start by recognizing all of those who made this report a reality. First, allow me to thank the government of Norway, whose financial support has been instrumental to go through the entire process that led to the elaboration of the report. And I would also want to specifically recognize the community of experts that first gather at a consultation workshop convened by UNEP in January 2019, and then met again and expanded and discussed at two meetings, one held back-to-back to the fourth session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, and then again at the 2019 session of the World Circular Economy Forum. All those experts played a very critical role in conceptualizing the context of this report, and they include representatives from fashion and textile industry, government, international organization, NGOs, advocacy group, technical organization, and fashion institutes, and they add up to a group of over 80 experts. And I would definitely not forget recognizing the UNEP team that has been led by Bettina, from whom you will hear shortly, that has been really pulling together the report, as well as the colleagues of the Green Growth Knowledge Partnership for having co-hosted the webinar today. I will now just spend a few words to comment how this report fits in and aims to accelerate the work of UNEP on sustainable consumption and production, and thereby contributes to advancing Sustainable Development Goals 12 and other related Sustainable Development Goals and targets. We recognize that we're currently facing three planetary crises: a climate crisis, a biodiversity and nature crisis, and a pollution and waste crisis. These three crises are caused by our unsustainable consumption and production, and are threatening human health, prosperity, and equity. Therefore, to address those crises in a combined fashion, scaling up circularity and sustainable consumption and production is absolutely essential. Why do I make the connection between those three crises and sustainable consumption and production and circularity? Well, according to the experts of the International Resource Panel, the extraction and processing of resources causes half of the global greenhouse gases emissions, and much of the biodiversity loss and water stress. Natural resources continue to be extracted and will likely raise from an amount of 92 billion tons today to an amount of 190 billion tons by 2060, therefore doubling in amount. Studies also show that currently our world and our economy and our societies are but 8% circular. While this tells a lot about our current consumption and production practices, it also points to the fact that we have a huge space for circularity and for sustainable consumption and production to offer us rapid gains and opportunities. And how can we go about taking advantage of those gains and opportunities? Well, first of all, we need to find the most effective way to connect the scientific knowledge that we have on natural resources and the environment with action on sustainable consumption and production. And the process and the approach that enables us these closest and most effective connection is a value chain approach. That value chain approach allows us to understand where the biggest opportunities for improvement occur and shape action to take advantage of those opportunities. This approach is an approach that UNEP as an organization is following in a number of sectors and is now replicating that approach using this pathway also for the textile value chain. And I'll just spend a minute to take you briefly through what you see on the screen, which are the steps of this approach, and ultimately also the steps that have been taken in the report that we're launching today. It starts, the application of the value chain approach starts by understanding the nature, the extent, and the complexity of the value chain, understand who are the actors that are part of this value chain, and identify in this value chain the key hotspots, meaning those areas with the greatest opportunities for improvement. Understanding also and consolidating existing action in the context of the value chain is extremely important to point us to have more clarity on which are the gaps in addressing hotspots that need to be addressed. Looking at gaps that allow us to promote action upstream at the level of design and production, midstream at the level of consumption and use, and downstream at the level of disposal and recycling. Those information are essential for us to identify our vision, our agenda for the value chain, as well as prioritize action that will help us to achieve progress in achieving that vision. Therefore, the value chain approach, grounded on solid scientific information, gives us the most effective opportunity to align all value chain actors behind a common vision and a set of concerted action. And how this translates into the textile value chain is what you will hear now from Bettina, to whom I'm giving the floor.
Thanks a lot, Elisa. And also from my side, a warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us today from different time zones. I know for some of you it's early or late, so we appreciate you take the time. Just to quickly start with sort of a snap overview of the textile industry, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. It is a very important one, because it provides work opportunities for more than 300 million employees along the value chain, and many of those are actually women. At the same time, we know that, for instance, clothing production approximately doubled in the last 15 years. So there has been a trend to produce more and more. But at the same time, the recycling of these clothes is very low. So actually, we have less than 1% recycled. Then we have high environmental impacts of the industry that I'm gonna walk you through later on. On the next slide, we just wanted to mention to you what is actually covered in the analysis of our report. So we are looking obviously at the textile value chain, but what do we mean when we say textiles? So textiles includes industry and technical textiles, as well as apparel and household. Apparel by itself makes actually up 60% of global demand for fibers. So it has the biggest part. Environmental profile of household textiles and apparel is very similar. Together, the two of them would make 80% of the fiber mix. And so in our analysis in the report, we do look at apparel, but since it does make a lot of the fiber mix of the global textile value chain, we think the results are fairly indicative also of the textile value chain as a whole. Now on the next slide, you can see a depiction of the linear textile value chain. So the value chain includes stages and sub-stages. So for instance, we see that fiber production can again be referred to as sub-stages on raw material production and then material processing and so on. In addition to the activities that you see here on the slides, it's also important to take into account the actors and stakeholders of the textile value chain, because they are the ones that influence actually the business models and the way that products are produced and consumed. And if we think about going towards a more sustainable and circular system, then it is key to think about how the behavior and the approaches of those actors also has to be taken into account and can shift to enable this more circular system. Now, if we click one more time, we'll see an attempt to draw the textile value chain in a more circular way. So you can see here that ideally we will have most of the fibers and textiles staying in the loop. And then there are different circular processes to extend the life and the use of the textiles. So for instance, reducing by design or refusing and reusing or repairing textile products. In the report, we still stick to the linear representation because it's a lot more readable. But of course, the ambition is to move towards a more circular system. On the next slide, we can see the geographical breakdown of global apparel production. And what I would just like to note here is that we can see that with the rising value add of the product, the global share really diversifies geographically. So the stages where there's more lower value add are primarily taking place in Asia and developing or transitioning countries at the moment, whereas the later stages have the higher value add to the products being sold. And those are mostly by major players in Europe and North America. On the next slide, we can see how this was especially in the news during the COVID-19 now, because we could see that, of course, those that are working in the producing countries, they are the most vulnerable, and they were also disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 impacts. So here, this is really a non-exhaustive list. I'm sure there are many other points we could add, but it's just to show, again, taking a value chain approach, that we have to consider different parts of the chain. So for instance, we know that there were a lot of impacts on the textile workers due to the cancel of orders that put workers' livelihoods at risk. But also if we look, for instance, at end of life, we could really witness now an increase in the fabric waste due to the cancelled orders and due to decreases in sales. And all of this, in the end, of course, also affect the sustainability of the sector. Now, on the next slide, before going into showing you some of the results of our analysis, I just wanted to recap what a hotspot is. Elisa already talked about it, but just to keep in mind that a hotspot is the stage in the life cycle of a product that accounts for a significant part of its environmental, social, or economic impact. The reason why this is important is that our report tries to identify hotspots, and sometimes we might say that for a certain stage we don't see a hotspot, but that doesn't mean that there are no impacts in that stage. It just means that it's not the most important stage for that particularly impact. And this approach allows us to have interventions that are more focused on priority needs and to achieve the greatest possible reduction. Now, Next slide, we look at the environmental hotspots. Just to give you an overview, there are hotspots along the value chain. Obviously, we can see, for instance, at the beginning of the value chain, there are certain hotspots relating to fiber production that come from chemical and water use in cotton cultivation. But we also have really high climate impact in the synthetic fiber production because of the use of fossil fuels. I think this is always also an interesting example to move the conversation away from just thinking about which fibers could replace which fibers, and to keep in mind that each fiber will also have their own footprint and own environmental impacts that they would leave. We can see at end of life that the impacts themselves are relatively low, meaning the environmental impact from recycling or landfilling textiles isn't high. But if we think about the value loss that we get by the underutilization of textiles, then it is actually quite a considerable stage to also consider. Now, next slide, we start looking at different impact areas that we're analyzing in the report. So the first one is the impacts on climate, which has also been in the news quite a lot. If we look at the profile of global apparel, we can see that the highest impact actually comes from the bleaching, dyeing, and finishing phases, which is due to the energy use that is required for this phase. But there's actually also considerable impact in the use phase due to the laundering of clothes. And what's also important to note here is that it depends very much on the energy mix that the country would use. So for instance, coal-based energy versus renewables. And of course, it will depend on the the laundry behavior of the consumers. In some countries, it is very common, for instance, to only do cold wash, and that will decrease the impact. One takeaway that we draw from here is that the greatest potential to actually reduce the climate impact is by extending the useful life of clothes and changing laundry practices. So these are two areas where efforts should lie in the future. For the next slide, we see the impact on water resources. So here we start with the analysis of freshwater use, which is not surprising that it's high in the raw material production phase, which is mostly due to cotton irrigation, but also the bleaching, dyeing, and finishing of textiles. What's interesting to note again is here the highest is actually in the use phase, again, depending on on how many times, for instance, we wash our jeans. We've also looked at the water scarcity footprint, which is on the next slide. And it's interesting to look at that opposed to the water use, because the water scarcity footprint will vary per country, as each country has a different water available for human and industrial purposes and for ecosystem services. So depending on the water scarcity of the region, the footprint will be higher. And our analysis showed that the highest water scarcity footprint from apparel is in China, but it's followed by India and the USA. Now, on the next slide, we see the impacts on ecosystems. So here, of course, we have to consider the high chemical use for the production of apparel. What's quite interesting to note is that global cotton cultivation is estimated to require 200,000 tons of pesticide and 8 million tons of fertilizers per year, which accounts for 16% of global use of pesticides and 4% of global use of fertilizers. But in the end, cotton is only accounting for 2.5% of arable land use. So that means those numbers are even more impressive if we think that cotton is actually only cultivated on 2.5% of the land. Now, the final impact category that we analyze in the report is the impact on land use on the next slide. Here we can see that the highest impact comes from the raw material production, which is again due to cotton cultivation, but also has a small contribution from cellulosic fibers. And what we should note here is that whether individual countries have land use profiles similar to the global apparel profile that we show here very much depends on their energy mix in the country, because the blue bars that you see on the other stages, they actually mostly come from the energy that is being used to produce apparel. So depending on whether, for instance, the country will use biomass in the energy mix, that number will be higher or lower. Now, to summarize, sorry, not yet. In the next slide, we to summarize the socioeconomic impacts. Here we also did a hotspots analysis, but just to feature some of the results with you, that from apparel we have high human health damage, which comes from the chemical management in the plants, which causes occupational illnesses, but also the extraction and burning of fossil fuels for the energy intensive stages of the value chain. And of course, microfibers are very much a topic that are in the news now. Here, we really have to do more research to actually know about the impacts on human health, but also know about how to best address this issue. The social risks is something that has been in the news quite a bit over the last years, and there are a lot of initiatives came up to already address this issue, but much more remains to be done, as we've now also seen during the COVID-19 outbreak. So the problems that we have are, for instance, poor working conditions, which include excessive working hours and low wages, workers being exposed to abusive practices, and unsafe working conditions. And those are due to nature of the industry, which unfortunately overarching still asks for short lead times, demands flexibility, and there's always a search for the lowest price. Finally, here to note that we also should consider again the value loss at end of life. I've already focused on it from an environmental point of view, but we should also look at it from an economic point of view, because it also comes at a high US dollar cost. So we estimate that the material loss by underutilization of apparel actually accounts up to 100 billion US dollars, which is quite considerable. Now, on the next slide, you can see the summary of the hotspot that we have identified in the report. I won't go into details, but I wanted to mention to you that in the report, and that's something for time reasons I won't do today, but we then go on to analyze the many initiatives that are already happening in the space per value chain stage and per the hotspots, to look at which parts already seem to be well covered. Of course, we can't hope to be comprehensive because there's a lot happening, but we are making an effort to showcase certain initiatives that already address certain of those impact areas. And based on this and consultations that we led at different events that Elisa outlined before, we then came up with 3 priority actions and needs that need further attention. So I will summarize those for you on the next slide. And what we've seen in our analysis, and what we've also really heard a lot in the consultations we've heard, is that what is needed for the value chain to become more sustainable and circular is stronger governance and policies, more work on collaboration and finance, and changes in consumption habits. So when we talk about stronger government and policies, there are actually a few countries that are really championing this and that are looking at circularity and sustainability in textiles and have a lot of great policy instruments that we can learn from. But there are also other countries where not so much support is provided yet, or the actions are not yet implemented. And we see a need for more exchange also between policymakers to learn from each other. Of course, we also have to consider that the textile value chain is very much global, so it will need collaboration between governments to put into place the right incentives and disincentives. Some examples that we mentioned in the report is, for instance, sustainable public procurement criteria or regulations, eco-design requirements. And what's of course important also is that each measure thinks about an inclusive and just transition, because as I said, this is a sector that provides a lot of work opportunities to many people. So if we shift to a more sustainable system, we also have to think about potential consequences this could have on them and how they can be mitigated. On collaboration and financing, we see a need to more collaborate because there are a lot of initiatives and tools, but maybe there's a need to better put them into a one source stop, or also to have better collaboration between those initiatives, make sure that all industry players, also the small size players, can reach those tools. And funding, in terms of really leveraging financing to implement the changes that are needed to business models and technologies. And finally, we need more spaces for collaboration. For the consumption habits, I think many of us know that we often have good intentions, but then when it comes to taking a quick decision, we sometimes don't take sustainability so much into account as we should. So we see there's an urgent need to also change consumer attitudes to provide better information, but also to make sure that sustainability becomes the easy option, and to build acceptance for more circular models. Because if we want the industry to provide more, let's say, rental services or repair services, then this also needs to be endorsed by the consumers, of course. And I'm going to finish just by saying that we aim to provide leadership in this issue and convene partners. So again, to say this report is very much an outcome of many experts' views that I would like to say thank you again for providing. And of course, today we hear from a lot of them. And next slide, this is just my thank you. And then I'll hand back over to Laila. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bettina. I think that was fantastic. And we're wondering actually whether we could quickly keep you on the camera, because there were a few questions about the report methodology. So a couple that came up, I just thought maybe you could quickly say what was the data source for the different impact analysis that you showed? And also, did you have things like leather in scope when you were doing the analysis?
Yeah. So in general, on the methodology, I'm just going to say it short, but we got this question a lot before actually, and we have two specific boxes in the report that explain the methodology a bit more in depth, also the sort of databases we used and so on for the environmental and for the socioeconomic analysis. But it's based on one life cycle assessment of global apparel product. And we did then check with other life cycle assessments that were done to see if it confirms our finding, but of course it's always hard to have a one-to-one comparison because the boundaries are usually quite different. And no, leather was not in the scope, because what we did is we took the global typical apparel mix for baseline year of 2016, which included a different fiber mix between natural fibers, synthetics, and linen. And we also outlined the exact fiber mix we considered in the report, but yes, leather was unfortunately not in the scope.
Perfect, thank you so much. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is pivot to my panel. I think, first of all, just to say, I think the report is adding a huge amount of value in terms of, we often look at these topics in isolation in the fashion and textiles industry. We look at climate or we look at water, but actually I think it's extremely valuable to see all the different impacts across the value chain and really spelled out in terms of one holistic analysis, including the key environmental and social aspects. So I think that part of the report will add a huge amount of value. I also think it's great to capture, I mean, it's terrible, but useful to capture the impacts that COVID is having on the value chain, because any plan that we put together will have to account for some of the limitations and challenges currently being faced in the industry. And finally, I think the diagram, the circular value chain approach is going to be really important to keep in our minds when we're going into the next session. Really thinking about how did that linear model transform into a circular model, and what would that do in terms of key impacts. So I want to now bring on our panel. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Emanuela Gregorio, who is an economist and Fashionomics, Africa coordinator from the African Development Bank Group. So Emanuela, if you'd like to turn your camera on. Hi, great. And then the second person I will introduce is Kehua Hu, who's the Deputy Director of the Office for Social Responsibility in SINTAC, the Chinese National Textile Association. Hi, Kehua. The third person is Arizona Muse, who is a model, sustainability consultant and activist. Welcome, Arizona. Would you like to put your camera on? Hi, perfect. The fourth person is Francois Souchet, who's the lead for Make Fashion Circular from the Ella MacArthur Foundation. Like to join us, Francois? And then the fifth person is Rebecca Uggla, who is the senior advisor for the Swedish Environment Protection Agency. Hi, Rebecca. Perfect. So I'm going to kick off by turning to Francois. Francois, we saw a very clear model from the UNEP team about what a circular value chain could look like, and we heard about some of the key impacts that are sitting currently within the linear conventional fashion model. Could you share with us some concepts of what you see as what does good look like for circular and sustainable fashion and textiles? What should we be aiming for ultimately in this journey together?
Great, thanks for this, Laila. At the foundation, we worked a lot on building a perspective of what good looks like for circular fashion, and at the moment we structure it around three key areas. The first one is, as Bettina said, increasing utilization, so finding either new business models or designing products so they're more durable, to really look at radically increasing the average number of times clothing is effectively worn. The second area is what we call made to be made again. So basically ensuring that the way in which we make clothing aligns with the available recycling technology so that it is recyclable in practice, but also developing the infrastructure that will enable this to effectively happen. And the third area is making sure that clothing is made from safe, renewable or recycled materials. So making sure that all the chemistry that goes into making clothing is safe, doesn't cause harm to either the workers or the environment in the process, that it comes from either recycled sources, especially if it's from finite resources, or from renewable ones, with a priority for regenerative sources when it makes the most sense.
Perfect, thank you. So I might now turn to Arizona, because we've just heard from Francois, what good would look like, what we're aiming for in circular and sustainable fashion. We also saw that a huge amount of the potential impact is actually coming from the use phase and the consumer phase. So I'm really interested to know, given that we know that the consumer needs to change maybe their way of consuming fashion and textiles, but also their kind of use phase impacts, what do you think are the best levers to use to try and make those new ways of behaving aspirational, or to kind of engage people to share the right information? And do you think that role models such as yourself would have a role in that communication to the user?
I definitely think leaders, role models of any kind, including parents, have a role to play in making sustainability seem more attractive. I think there's a common misunderstanding that having a sustainable life will be less comfortable. It'll be a bit scratchy and brown, and it won't work very well. And so I think this is the biggest hurdle for us all to overcome, is just to show that having a sustainable life, I personally find way more comfortable, a lot more fun, very smooth and fine and refined and sophisticated, and it's an amazing shift in my life. I play a game with myself to make it fun, where I think of my life as a game now. Like, how can I reduce here? What can I increase my positive impact? And you're constantly keeping tabs on the actions that you make, and it becomes really, really inspiring to yourself all day, every day. I also think that brands who create products have a responsibility to make a good product. Please, please, please do not release a bad product onto the market. It's really harmful. It is, because if somebody is trying something sustainable for the first time and it doesn't work, they may give up. And that is doing a disservice to the whole world. So please, good products, but also real inspiration about how amazing a sustainable life feels.
Thank you very much. So Kehua, I might turn to you now. In some of the diagrams that Bettina showed, the word China was very big letters for where some of the key production impacts sit. And so I'm interested to know, given that we also saw that there's a really strong role for government to play in helping to create this transition, to create the enabling conditions for the transition to circular textiles, can you speak a little bit about what is happening in China around the policy and the framework around, incentivizing this transition to circularity?
Yeah, in fact, China has vigorously promoted the circular economy in 2005. So, and in 2008, China issued the circular economy promotion law to accelerate its circular development. And especially in 2013, China issued the Circular Economic Development Strategy and the near-term action plan to transform both economy and society at all levels in more systematic way. And I believe that it was the world first national plan for the circular economy in action. So especially in this action plan, we can find it outlined a basic model of circular economy development in the textile and apparel industry. So its direction to accelerate the replacement of a raw material, promoting energy conservation and the consumption reduction, and strengthening the utilization of the waste resource, promoting the standardized development of the textile waste recycling. So we try to build up, drive the whole industry towards the circular economy.
Thank you. I think that sounds really exciting. So actually what I might do is pivot to Rebecca, because obviously you're also sitting more in that policy space. And I know that Sweden has already undertaken some activities around trying to create a sort of welcoming policy environment for circular fashion and textiles. Can you speak a little bit about what's underway already in Sweden? Oh, you're muted. Still muted. It should be a separate pane.
Now?
Ah, now you're good.
Oh, this is strange because it says here that I'm not muted. Okay, so Sweden has been working with textiles for quite some time now, and we are working with it both on as a consumer perspective, but also with stakeholders. So we think that the solution to the problems, because there's not just one problem here, cannot be solved by one single group. We need to work at the same time with different kinds of groups. Sweden's opinion is, for example, that the European textile strategy should cover the entire value chain from production to the use and waste stages. And Sweden really wants to see a holistic approach as well as sector-specific solutions. Now, amongst the topics that we think are highly prioritized is the restriction of use of harmful chemicals in textiles. And we also want to see design requirements on textiles building on eco-design principles. We want to reduce the leakage of microplastics. We want to have to ensure effective sorting and recycling by creating traceability. And we also think that the term eco-friendly should be protected in legislation. This summer, the Swedish government actually adopted a national strategy for circular economy that sort of sets out the direction and ambition for a long-term and sustainable transition of the Swedish society. And this circular economy strategy actually contains a section about textiles. Now, the focus area in this strategy is sustainable production and product design, sustainable ways of consuming and using materials, products, and services. We also want to work for these toxin-free and circular eco-cycles. And we think about the driving force for the business sector and other actors through we really want to promote innovation and circular business models. So what do we do, actually? I mean, these are our ambitions. Right now, we have an investigation, an ongoing investigation about what an extended producer responsibility could be formed. And these findings will be published in the middle of December. We've also had an investigation regarding taxation on fashion regarding chemicals, and this report contains suggestions on how this could be done, but this is under public consultation right now, so we're not really sure what it will look like in the end. We have a reduced taxation, VAT, on repairing of textiles. We have no tax on non-profit organizations, the ones collecting and for secondhand selling, sorting. And the Swedish government has also given the University of Borås a 5-year assignment to establish and lead a national platform for sustainable fashion and textile. This is called Textile and Fashion 2030. And this is a neutral arena that enables new sustainable solutions and business opportunities for the textile and fashion industry. We also have, you see, you need to stop me if I'm talking too much. We have an ongoing campaign called Textile Smart, where the Swedish Chemicals Agency and the Swedish Consumers Agency, together with the Swedish EPA, have started to have a dialogue with the Swedish consumers on Instagram. Right now, we have approximately 9,000 followers. We also have been working with stimulating the development of more sustainable business models by promoting a project called Textile. So a lot is going on. We are about to start a cooperation, a Nordic cooperation on this. And Sweden is also working with the standardization of environmental aspects for textiles.
Fantastic. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. So what I might do is pivot and come back to some of the things that you've raised. And I think one of the key things you flagged was the need to support innovation and sort of, you know, maybe either the sort of startup or the technology side of circularity, as well as trying to change existing players. So I'm actually wondering, Emanuela, if you're able to give us an insight. You've been working a lot with particularly people in the African region to try and support the development of startups and technology solutions around circularity and sustainability. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about what you think are the key incentives or kind of mechanisms that are able to really, you know, help and support SMEs and other innovators to get to scale.
Thanks a lot, Laila. So a starting point here is to understand, you know, before talking about the funding and scaling up sustainable business models in the fashion industry, is to understand the context in which we operate in. For example, in the more industrialized countries and the Western world or emerging economies, you see a lot of innovative financing initiatives to support entrepreneurs, innovators, and manufacturers to scale up these sustainable business models that meet the requirements of the circular economy for the fashion industry. But we cannot say the same for developing countries, such in regions such as Africa, where there are more pressing needs that needs to be addressed, you know, starting from access to basic needs and infrastructure development and so forth. That we also we're talking about also Asia. Asian countries are raised a lot of attention when it comes to becoming the manufacturing hub of the fashion industry in terms of, you know, supplying for all the global value chains. But we cannot say the same for the continent, because you have very few countries, and think of Ethiopia, that are trying to build their production capacity, because the fashion industry on the continent is made of micro, small, and medium enterprises that are operating in the informal sector, and they serve local markets. So you think about their export capacity is very limited compared to other regions. This to say, these are few major areas. Just to say again, when we talk about access to funding and scalability of sustainable business model, we need to think about their entry barriers that these entrepreneurs face in accessing funding. So thinking about the region and also our experience with that in supporting the entrepreneurs through Fashionomics Africa initiative is that there is a market failure between supply and demand. So entrepreneurs are not considered credible in the eyes of the banking sector, for example, because they are informal, because they are not well structured, because they don't have economic assets, they lack collateral, they have very unstable cash flows. So the seasonality of their business make it very complicated
complicated. So financiers from the financial intermediaries, they don't understand well their business. On the other hand, the financial intermediaries, they don't have a suitable analytical and risk mitigation framework tailored for the fashion entrepreneurs. So you see that there is this lack of where the supply and demand don't meet, but it's really here that we need to operate. So and this is also how we work through our initiative. So we support the micro small fashion businesses, which have, of course, now circular economy is a relatively new team and also area where developing banks like us are venturing in, but it's high in the agenda because it's part of our green growth agenda also that we want to foster within African economies. So we train entrepreneurs, and on this we are working with UNEP and Bettina's team, and we are very happy of this collaboration. Also, we are talking with Francois from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So how can we provide access to information, relevant information when it comes to this specific topic, about sustainability and ethical sourcing and circularity actions, but also about, again, more basic needs that we need to have these businesses to formalize, like business and financial acumen, how to access to funding, how to access to data that is not available, unfortunately, out there, especially on the continent, data that is needed for them to, to develop strategic and business planning, but also to make the business case to justify the investment in them, and also to assess the return on investment. So you see, there are many needs that are basic needs that need to happen before talking about how do we scale up sustainable business models. But of course, the key also, and also part of what the report is saying, is that there is the need to invest, accelerate innovation, and invest and crowd in investment in this space. Just to conclude, there is, when it comes to access to funding, we need a concerted efforts from different stakeholders and create alliances. For example, we recently we became a strategic partner of the Africa Circular Economy Alliance, which is a nation-led and with other partners that wants to foster circularity in African economies. And we are coming up with financial and non-financial instruments for this to happen.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Emanuela. I think what I want to do is spend a little bit of time on the kind of the policy space, and then I think we've got lots of questions coming in on the consumption space as well, so we'll pivot back to Brown in a second. What I'd quickly like to do is ask Rebecca to maybe just make a few comments on what you see as the role of maybe the consumption markets like Sweden, like the EU, especially thinking about the EU's current work on circular fashion and textiles. What role do you see for those countries to support economies like the African region to actually help them address, some of the challenges around circular and sustainable textiles?
Okay, so we have initiated what we called the Textile Dialogue, which is meetings. It's with the long-term goal of these meetings and workshops is to reduce the environmental and health impact from the entire textile value chain. So from production and consumption to waste management, and to contribute to resource efficient and non-toxic ecocycles. And these this is cooperation between the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency and the Swedish Chemicals Agency, and we want to involve relevant actors in order to create action power around relevant issues in the textile value chain. And these dialogues, they take place in collaboration with the actors in the textile area, such as authorities, industry, organizations, innovation, education actors, researchers, voluntary organizations, as well as municipal representatives and secondary actors. During these meetings, the participants have the opportunity to discuss methods that reduce the environmental impact and the use of chemicals, tools, innovative solutions, funds to apply for the development work and ongoing research. And there is also the opportunity to exchange experiences, networking, and inspiration for new innovative solutions. And in the cases where during this discussion, the industry and the authorities find out that this is the problem that we can solve in some of these ways, then we can work cooperatively together to strive forward. And we've had 6 meetings, and we are investigating this work right now. The last meeting we had was 2 weeks ago, where we focused on international perspectives and cooperations from an environmental and chemical perspective. And these speeches were filmed, and they, in a short while, I guess that they're public, so everybody can see them. And we focused a lot about on transparency and traceability, standardization, blockchain technology, and other stakeholder initiatives. So we hope that we have reached something good, but yeah, well, I'd love to share the results when we have done this investigation.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And I want to pivot now to Francois to really explore. I mean, we've heard a lot about the role that some policymakers are taking on to try and incentivize both change in their own countries and those globally. But how much real change do you see happening in the business models of companies today? How much do you see them really adopting these new models versus sort of having barriers and challenges to actually scaling those?
I think that's a very good question. So what we see is, to some extent, you've got like a few innovators that are natively circular in their business models. So you think about Vesta Collective, ThreadUp, etc., whose sole goal is to make sure that the clothing that exists today can be circulated more between people. And then you've got large organizations who are starting their transition, and for them it takes a lot more effort and it's a lot more difficult. I mean, with thousands of employees, billions of dollars in revenues, and turning around a ship that big takes years, basically. And so what we see is a few of them are starting to explore circular business models or even circular product design as something that's a little bit on the side of their core business and as seen often as a complement to what they're already doing. But if we want to be really successful in this transition, if we want to be able to curb the impact that the industry has to a point that it is on the trajectory to 1.5 degrees, all the evidence shows that those models that are today seen as add-on to the core business model will have to replace it over the years. So what we see is it's very good, because when we started talking about, like, when we started our work on fashion 3-4 years ago, the main narrative in the industry was recycling is the solution. We just need to find a good recycling technology and it will solve everything. And that has moved on to, actually, we need to design products that can be recycled. We need to evolve our business model so that we can increase clothing use and we can curb our like problem with overconsumption, overproduction. I think the more that narrative shifts, the more pilots we see, the more success cases we have, the faster the transition can happen. So I think we're kind of like in the early stages, but it's on the kind of positive trend.
Fantastic, thank you. And I want to turn now to Arizona. One of the things that are very interesting is there are emerging models that are genuinely exciting or transformative. But I'm curious to know, what examples have you seen of really, radically improved business models or consumer offers that are going to, deliver the biggest impact reduction, especially thinking about circularity?
I think the key word here is regenerative, not sustainable anymore, because sustainable has been so overused and no one even knows what it meant and never did. And let's just leave that one behind and move on to regenerative and transformative, like you just said, Laila. I think that there are so many different business models. I particularly am doing a lot of looking into community interest companies right now, which is a UK way of arranging a structure of a company so that the company doesn't exist as something that someone could own, which is really important, because then you can't have a pyramid and you can't have one owner who's going to benefit off of the work and tears and sweat of other people. I find that really interesting. I also find reducing simple changes and adjustments to business models that fashion brands may already have could be reducing the number of SKUs. Why are you producing so much stuff? I also think that it's really important for everybody, and I do not mean this as an insult, I love fashion. Every single thing we make, not just the offcuts, is waste. So let's admit that and just say we're an industry who's making loads of waste. Even our products are waste. And once we recognize that, then we can go, oh, okay, so let's treat them as waste, even though we love them and they're beautiful and we're putting all this love and energy into them. We want them to be amazing. We want people to wear them for as long as possible, to keep them away from the landfill for as long as possible. But we do recognize that eventually they will end up in there. So make waste that is nutritive rather than waste that is toxic. And this is why a lot of brands are working so hard on creating biodegradable clothing, organic clothing with natural dyes that aren't toxic. Then we come into another problem, which is that municipalities and governments are not yet helping those people who are working super hard to make a really nature-friendly product to then dispose of that product, because the consumer at the end of the life of the garment, whether that's 10 years or 50 years or 100 years, even if I wear this jacket, which is a vintage one, probably from the 80s because of the shoulders, even if I give this to my daughter and she wears it for another 45 years after that, eventually it will at some point go into the dump. When it does, cities really, really need to have an infrastructure for collecting compost, food waste, clothing waste, anything that is biodegradable, because at the moment it's wasteful to have people working so hard to make biodegradable clothing and then putting it into the normal mainstream infrastructure that takes it to the dump.
Fantastic, thank you very much. I want to turn to Kehua actually, because I think a lot of focus at the moment goes on Europe and America as the consumption markets, but obviously there's huge regions of the world like China and India where you have a growing middle class and lots of consumption happening. And I'm interested to know, how aware are the Chinese consumers about some of these topics? We have some awareness, but not necessarily brilliant action in some of our kind of traditional consumption markets. But what does it look like in China? And are there key actions that you think will help them to actually also make that adjustment in their behavior?
Okay, thank you, Laila. So, in fact, since last year, we collaborate with CMF and the Lansing Group to do a survey from the Chinese consumers with 5,000 Chinese consumers. So we got the very positive result from this survey, this research. So the consumers' awareness of the sustainable consumption has improved significantly, and the most of them are willing to act for sustainability. For example, more than 67% of the consumers in the survey pay attention to the sustainable product, and about 26 of them not only pay attention to this sustainable product, but also will purchase them intentionally. So, and more than 90% of consumers accept a price premium. So it's very positive result we get from the Chinese consumer, but the quality is the first in the priority. So, but it was worth noting that only 27% of them buy sustainable product. So you know the gap. So
yeah, exactly.
And if we talk about the attitude of them, the consumer they aware of the economic value of the textile waste. So, but the 75% of consumers want the waste clothes to be treated through some form of approved channel. So that means it's safe. And the raising of the awareness, of the second-hand clothes and the clothes rental, especially for the special occasions, and only 18% consumers said they would not accept second-hand clothes. It's still it's not a majority part, but it's still someone don't accept the waste. And the 34% of the consumers choose to buy the second-hand clothes for wearing. I mean, for some special occasion. So the results show that it's necessary for the brands and the companies to take into account about the quality and the fashion and the comfortable of the clothes when designing, when producing, or the selling, I mean, of the green clothes at a reasonable price. So, so if we talk about the, I believe the Chinese consumers would be the majority for the sustainable product in the future.
I mean, that's great news. That means that actually some of the sort of traditional ways of thinking that, you know, consumers are behind the curve, actually consumers are very aware in a lot of different regions around the world. I wanted to pick up on what you said, Kehua, about the gap between what people say they will do and what they actually sometimes do. And actually, I wanted to throw this to you, Francois, just as a kind of curveball, because I think, you know, we all talk about this gap between what they self-report as, you know, being important and then what actually happens. And I'm just curious in terms of some of the kind of the more profitable parts of the business models that we see growing that are circular. What are they doing right that's like helping people to bridge that gap? How do we make it so that it's attractive at the point of sale to people who might want to purchase more circular items?
Yeah, I think Arizona will have some like addition to that perspective, but what we see as the main driver of behavior is like convenience, incentives, and desirability. And I think one of the and a bit to what Arizona was saying about like having some stuff that's brown and itchy. I think the main idea is the solutions that will win people over are the solutions that tick the main boxes that drive decision, which is convenience, incentive, desirability, and sustainability often comes as a bit the cherry over the top. It's the nice story that you can add to a product that's already successful, a service that's already successful. And I think what the key aspect in that is what we see as being quite successful is when organizations manage to really reconcile on those different aspects and provide a service that works. I mean, when you look at why secondhand is growing quite quickly, what you see is there's different elements, and sustainability comes actually quite late into the list of reasons why it works. Like there's the price point at which you can access clothing that's of quite high quality or desirable brands. There's the other aspect of, well, it's quite unique, so it allows you to express yourself without necessarily looking like your neighbor. Then you've got also the entire digital aspect, which makes it a lot easier to list stuff for secondhand or even to buy. Now you don't have to spend hours in a thrift shop. I mean, a lot of people like it, but a lot of people find it a bit like distracting to just browse through stuff and try to find it. Now it's like Net-a-Porter, right? You go on the website, you can search by brand, by size, by color. It's very easy, it's very convenient. So it needs to really check the right boxes to be successful. And then I think a lot of the work that a brand or an organization has to do is get all the kind of like operational aspects, right? Like how do you start working from, usually you work with like standard SKUs, which can cover like a lot of different products, to like now working with individual product equal like one SKU, which completely changes the way in which you look after stuff, like optimizing reverse logistics, which you never probably thought about before. So there's a lot of question marks to like really get right and to optimize. And I think the more organizations are doing it, the more like economies of scale and learning will kick in, the more solution provider will come, and we see that growing quite quickly. But yeah, I think really getting the basic right is fundamental.
And I think one of the things that's also important is, you know, not creating silos within the industry. So I actually wanted to quickly ask Arizona to make a few comments about how do we take the things that we're learning about things being attractive to consumers. So, you know, leaning into what's great about fashion rather than trying to make it a sort of hemp sack. How do we engage those within the fashion industry who are, you know, more on the creative side, who are kind of setting the agenda but may not be experts in sustainability? What do we need to do to kind of transform their understanding of what an opportunity this could be for them?
I think it has a lot to do with educating everybody and making sure that everyone collaborates together. there's a lot of disconnect within a fashion brand, within its teams, especially the big ones, because there are so many people who work in these brands, and the design team talks to the product development team, but the product development team talks to the first factory, who talks to the second factory, and all the subcontractors after that, and there isn't a communication avenue from one end to the other end. And I think this is creating a lot of problems around brands having no idea how sustainable they are or not, and just having to do a huge amount of analysis and research just to find out where their problem areas are. And I hope that all new brands who are initiating themselves now will never have a supply chain that is that opaque. I think that was a thing that should have finished in the 80s when it started, but it didn't. Sadly, it continued, and we are looking at a global supply value chain that is horrific at the moment. The lack of transparency, which leads to huge abuses in human rights and abuses of natural resources, misuses of natural resources. I want to take a moment to talk about urgency, because I'm feeling it right now. Urgency is something that is a good thing. So anyone who looks at all this information and feels overwhelmed, which I do on a daily basis, that's okay. Take that overwhelm and take that sense of urgency and do something with it. Change your life. That really does help. I cannot say it enough. Changing your own life in the little ways that you can every single day, the ways you shop, the ways you stop shopping, the things that you buy for your home, the things you put on your body, all these things make you feel empowered, actually, rather than less powerful. But live with the urgency. We all must feel urgent. We are at the brink. I think the brink is a window of time, and we already have entered it. When Times Square, which they did recently, put a clock up for the public to see that, and the clock is counting down from 7 years, because that's when the science is saying that we have until 7 years. I personally feel like that moment has passed. We have passed the moment where we can return to the life that we had 40 years ago. It's just not going to happen anymore. So we have to look at a new future, and we have to be really realistic about that and not be fearful, but go in with courage and say, I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to start now and work as quickly as I can. I'm not going to do it the other way around, which is setting a target for 2050 that I may not start working toward until 2049.
I could not agree with you more. And I think, honestly, urgency is the watchword of all the industry initiatives that I'm party to as well. I just wanted to finish off, because I think that's such an important message. I wanted to quickly go to Emanuela in terms of, from your perspective of work in the African region, what are the most urgent things that the entrepreneurs and SMEs working in the African context really need from organizations in the global value chain, other policymakers around the world? Like, what do they need most urgently in order to help them transform?
Thank you, Laila. So the needs are many, right? But again, I would like to repeat the fact that there is the need now to come all together, from the financing sector to the policymakers to the private sector, and come up with alliances. There is the need on the policy level to recreate the ecosystem for these entrepreneurs that they put at the center of the business models, the sustainability actions in the fashion industry, and incentives to attract the private sector investments. On the financing side, as I said before, there is the need for a mix of approaches of different sources of funding, from, based on the maturity of the business of these entrepreneurs. For early stage and startups, you will need seed capital for them to kick off their and grants also to kick off their activities. When it comes to more advanced businesses, you need debt or equity financing for those at least that have a track record and also have an export capacity. Cluster financing also, it helps to stimulate economies of scale and also to foster collaboration between firms, supporting the promotion of the proliferation of alternative finance channels such as crowdfunding schemes, angel investors networks, and impact investors. With Fashionomics, we are at the moment working on developing a crowdfunding scheme that can be connected to our Fashionomics Africa digital marketplace, where they could access to alternative sources of funding. We are working with the likes of Facebook, Google, to help the entrepreneurs to embrace the fourth industrial revolution and go digital by also having more of a sustainable impact on their environments. We're working with Facebook, Google through our Fashionomics Africa master classes for them to learn how to have an online presence through e-commerce, marketing, and you name it. The needs are many, but this is where we are starting with, and of course working with UNEP in inculcating in these entrepreneurs to start from the beginning of their businesses to have sustainable practices. What is also interesting about African fashion entrepreneurs that many of them are putting sustainability at the core of the business model by using indigenous traditions or natural methods to produce their garments. But now is also the time now to scale up, to expand this kind of approach to all fashion entrepreneurs on the continent.
Thank you so much, Emanuela. And I think what I want to do is just quickly take a final statement from Francois, because I think what we've heard is lots of different perspectives on this challenge and lots of different efforts by different regional actors, by spokespeople and role models, by people working more in the financial space. So Francois, I just wanted to close with you the idea of how do we bring together and facilitate this kind of sharing between actors that I guess will be important for delivering circularity.
I agree. I think we've heard a lot about the importance of collaboration and all that. One thing that we've seen being very important to effectively drive collaboration is to have a shared North Star, to share a vision towards which we want to aim. Because the key thing is the more different interpretations you have of what good looks like, the more diluted the effort becomes, because everyone goes in different direction, and actually individual actions do not add up towards really affecting change towards the industry. And so what's really important is to have a shared vocabulary, making sure that we've got the same definitions for the words that we are using, and also making sure that we've got the same aim in terms of what we want to achieve collectively. And I think once you've got this basis, collaboration becomes a lot easier because you speak the same language, because you aim for the same thing. So bringing together governments and bringing together industry, like the civil society, education, all the people who need to be involved, becomes all of a sudden a lot easier because you agree on the principle that we all want to achieve this. And so you remove a lot of that kind of aspect of competing and I want this, I want that, and ensure some sort of effective coalition.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Francois. So we're going to open it up to, I can see there's been a lot of activity in the chat box popping up. So what we're going to do is pivot to some questions that different audience members have asked. And I will share some selected ones with you. So the first one I'm going to look at is actually a number of different people ask a similar question. So what I'm actually going to do is ask a version of it to everybody. The perception, a lot of the discussion is that transforming to circular and sustainable business models, or regenerative business models, if you take Arizona's version, is something that costs more money. So it's kind of like expensive, or there's barriers to achieving it for those who are on lower incomes, both in terms of consumers wanting to purchase items that are maybe more sustainable or circular, or producers wanting to address how their production system is working. So I maybe wanted to just go around and ask each of you to speak about, do you think that sustainable or circular models are more expensive fundamentally? And if so, how do we either give access to producers who are not hugely wealthy, or consumers who are not usually hugely wealthy? So I might start with Kehua. It's like, who's in the hot seat? Kehua, maybe you could speak a little bit about your experience working in China and whether or not you think that there's a cost barrier for producers or consumers. Actually, you have both significantly in your country. Do you see this as more expensive, and if so, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, maybe I can. I think it's we need to divided the different period. For example, 2 years ago, if we talk about the recycled PET, the polyester, so the price is just the cost replacement of the original polyester. So it's cheaper. That means you have a benefit, you have advantage to get the recycled polyester from the waste. I mean, but if we talk about the oil price, so it's maybe the lowest in history. So the original polyester, I mean, the price of the original polyester is twice than the recycled polyester. So that's no advantage, but that's the advantage from the market, because the consumer need the recycled polyester product from the retailers. So that's depend on the needs, I think, and depend on the economic situation. So, but for the long term, I mean, if we can, I can foresee if we are really on the track of the circular economy. So I mean, the whole society and the people can get the economic benefit from the recycled product. I mean, it's not expensive. Everybody can have a win-win. This is a win-win solution for everybody.
Fantastic. I'm very happy to hear you say that, Kehua. Emanuela, would you agree with that, thinking about your work that you've done in the African region? Do you think that it is ultimately going to deliver a win-win, or do you also see that there are barriers to access that we might need to address in terms of cost, both maybe for the producers, but also in an African context for the consumers as well?
Well, I do agree in the sense also that if there is, we need to ask ourselves if there is the demand and the market for a specific product. No, in this case, we are talking about products that comply with circular and sustainable principles. And since this is the way to go, because this is the future, also for the entrepreneurs themselves, there will be always a benefit for them to adopt the right technology to be able to produce in a more sustainable way. Of course, some businesses, because of their, the ethical sourcing principles that they operate and the sustainable actions that they take to produce their products, they manage also to create niche markets. And sometimes niche markets, at least with African and the African context, is also, a synonym of luxury. It depends also which market you want to serve. In Africa, you have a middle class that is growing, that has the purchasing power to buy your beautiful and sustainable products, which whatever is handmade comes with a higher, with a premium price. So it also depends which market you're trying to serve, which has different pricing also.
Thank you. Francois, do you want to briefly, I'm conscious of the clock, but if you want to briefly comment?
I think quickly what the two things we see is, one, there's an aspect of economies of scale and learnings that will start to kick in pretty quickly. I think what we're doing is really changing practices that have evolved over like 150 years and trying to change that quite quickly to new practices, and actually we need to learn and we need to reach scale in order to really like bring down the cost, which is a bit what Kehua mentioned, when like actually the scale for like demand for our pets grew, like the cost came down quite significantly. But then on the other side, what we see is like with our project with the jeans redesign, we have companies ranging from H&M to like Guess and others making jeans alongside like specific guidelines, and they're able to provide them at the price point at which they were able to provide their other products. So there's no variation in cost for those ones.
Perfect, thanks. Arizona, coming to you, do you feel like sustainable and circular models are just for the rich, or do you think that that's something that other sectors of society can also benefit from?
What I'm going to say is a bit brave, but it is 2020 and we have just lived through COVID. If you are someone, an individual or a business who has money, who is lucky enough to have money right now, it is your responsibility to spend it with people who are doing things right. Because there are so many individuals and businesses who just don't have the luxury of making that choice.
Good point.
There we
Rebecca,
go.
Do you want to respond to that? As a reasonably wealthy Western country, what do you think about that? Rebecca, can you hear me?
Oh, sorry, I didn't hear you saying my name. So I definitely, yeah, well, I definitely think that there is a possibility here in our, since we're working with both stakeholders and to promote more sustainable business models, but also in our dialogue with consumers. So we're trying to stimulate an increased demand for more sustainable products and services, and at the same time, since we try to increase the demand, we hope that the industry also can think of a changed supply. So in our ongoing info campaign, we are trying to inform about the environmental and health related impacts related to textiles, but we're not trying to do it as in a negative way, just like Arizona told, what are the positive, what can you do, what can you change? So what can easily be changed if you are a consumer and you want to contribute? And at the same time, to inform, to reach even further and to inspire even more, we have a cooperation with a project called Fact Movement. And the Fact Movement has recruited 70 influencers spread all over Sweden, and they have committed not to buy new products for a period of 9 months. And they meet regularly every month to talk about specific topics, and they are also given inspiration on remake or styling or how to buy secondhand. They change clothes with each other, and they also get challenges such as wearing the same shirt, for example, for 7 days and style it differently every day. And these influencers also spread their experiences on Instagram, and their followers can, or if they want to do the same, they can do the same as the influencer does. So Textile Smart sort of stands for the information and to increase the information and the knowledge in Sweden. But Fact Movement sort of stands for the experimental thing, the creativity, and to show that this is actually possible. Now, what does stakeholder think about this, and how do we see it? Well, these influencers, they share their experiences, and this is a great opportunity for businesses to sort of capture new values. So you can start to change your own business model, or you can start to focus on a totally new one. So, and this does not necessarily have to be expensive or difficult. I mean, free your mind. And we think that this is a great opportunity because since we're very open, every month there's a new topic that the influencers are working on. This is open information. So if they're working on remake, then stakeholders can start to have sort of remake offers in their shops for a certain period, and try, is this something that we can make money on? Is this a good offer in our city? So I think that there is there are only possibilities. We just need to see them and capture them.
Fantastic, thank you so much. I think this is really exciting that there's such an evidence base. I'm going to try and finish with 2 different questions, and I'm going to maybe pick on some people to answer them. One of the questions is, whose responsibility is it fundamentally? Is it the consumer to reduce their impact through changing behavior, or is it the responsibility of the brands and the policymakers to make a system that makes it easier for them to choose the right thing? Since Francois smiled when I asked that, I'm going to ask him to answer that question. Francois, whose job is it?
Well, I think it's the job of the one who's got most power to solve it, right? And I think the industry holds most of the cards in their hands to solve the problem by just changing the way in which they operate, changing the design of their product, like also changing the way they stimulate desire. I mean, billions of dollars of money are invested every year in order to direct the desire of people towards new is always better. And I think because of all those different aspects, the key responsibility is within the industry. And then it is the role of policymakers, education, to support, but also of like people, like their customers, to demand better solutions and better change. But fundamentally, the role is with the industry.
Fantastic. And then one final one, because we're running out of time. There's actually some amazing questions in the chat box, by the way, so hopefully we can capture them and follow up on some of them. But the final one I want to touch on is really the idea about climate justice and the potential trade-offs around circular solutions, because, you know, depending on the model we choose and the way that it rolls out globally, there could be winners and losers in this whole picture, and it could affect jobs and development and things like that. I'm actually wondering if I can just quickly go to Emanuela to speak about this, given the context she's been working in. You know, especially related to COVID, we've seen a lot of potential job losses in the fashion industry. And where do we see the climate justice and the job and the development part of this fitting in? And is there a potential that actually these models could help build jobs and you know, development, as well as potentially there being tensions and trade-offs?
Thanks, Laila. I mean, the COVID taught us that, especially in the fashion industry, we cannot anymore go ahead with this linear model, but we need to embrace a circular one and quickly. So I mean, it's part of the process. We need to embrace circular economy and green growth actions in everything that we do, and different stakeholders here have a role to play, from the public to the private sector.
Quite right. Oh, did she freeze? All good, Emanuela? Yeah. Okay, so what I might then do is just finally have a quick thought about how we're going to take all of this discussion forward. So we're at time now. I just wanted to kind of speak about the fact that all the stakeholders you see today are part of the UNEP's fantastic contact list of experts. And the process we'll be convening going forward is really to consult with lots of different parts of the industry and those kind of trying to support the transition. So I just wanted to kind of maybe very quickly just get a statement from everybody about what do you see as the most exciting thing for your stakeholder type in terms of what's happening in circularity and what you'd like to see from the efforts that are being supported by UNEP, and also how you'd like to then see that contributed into the roadmap. So maybe one sentence just to put you all on the spot. Rebecca, shall I start with you? I can see you thinking hard.
What a great question. And I'm to start. I think that there's a lot to do, and of course, cooperation is a very important part for the future work, as well as transparency and traceability, which is very hard, I guess, but very important. Well, and when it comes to the consumer, I think that we are the limit to ourselves. So we just need to sort of start trying, start doing, and that's not very hard. I mean, if you think about it, then you can do it. So, and it doesn't have to be difficult. So I think that we have challenges in front of us, but that is definitely possible to do as long as we talk to each other and really work on it.
Wonderful.
So I'm very happy for this report.
Dialogue, exactly.
Sorry.
Maybe Arizona, do you want to just sort of say what you think that would be the most exciting thing that we could take forward from this collaboration?
I truly enjoyed reading this report. It's like music in there in writing. It's just beautiful to think about the future of the fashion industry that's actually having a positive impact through its sourcing practices, but also the influence that it has on the rest of the world. I'm really positive about the future. I know that sounds weird in the face of climate change, but I do think we can do it, and we need to rely on people who know, like expert scientists and also indigenous peoples who've been protecting our planet forever, and they've been doing it diligently and dedicated, and we've been ignoring them, and now it's time to stop ignoring them and to treat them with true awe for the service that they have provided us for free for so long, and experience nothing but degradation, and just nothing nice has come their direction in gratitude. Can we just be grateful? The future holds really exciting things. It really does. When we all still start living in a more awakened way, when we all turn our brains on to notice what's going on around us in relationship with each other and in relationship with the earth and the animals who live here and the plants, it becomes quite simple and full of common sense. And that's what I love about a regenerative, sustainable future.
Amen. I agree completely. Francois, what would you say is your kind of one big thing that you're excited to see come out of this process?
Well, I think that in line with what we stand for, I'd say that the momentum towards the circular economy that's going is something that we're really excited about. And again, with the conversations moving into how do we create better products, how do we create better solutions, with this idea in mind, I think that's definitely something that excites us a lot.
Wonderful. Emanuela?
So, I mean, there are many things that needs to be done, but we all have a responsibility, and I'm also talking from the perspective of Development Bank, to help shaping this future, which focuses on sustainability in the fashion industry, because it won't happen by itself. For the African context, what I would like to see in the near future is the rapid adoption of new technologies, and that can be contextualized for the African continent, because it's different from other regions for the reasons that I listed before, and see how this technology can be scaled up with the lowest cost for the entrepreneurs, but also for the end consumers.
Perfect. And finally, Kehua.
Okay, thank you. So as you know, as you mentioned, the Chinese textile industry is an important part of the global fashion industry. So, so I believe China will act as an accelerator to speed up the transformation. So to set up, set up the forward-looking goals with the stakeholders all of the world, and unify the agenda and strengthen the industry collaboration at a different level. So especially for the technical innovation and the business model. So I'm looking forward to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to the whole panel. I think you've all been amazing in representing the work that you've done and the perspectives you bring and the diversity of the stakeholders that UNEP has also consulted with, which is fantastic. So Bettina's put her email address in the chat box if anybody wants to continue deep diving into these topics. There are lots of questions we didn't have time to get to. But thank you so much to the panel, and thank you so much to everybody who joined us online. And we will now close the session. And the report will be available shortly, I think. More information to follow. Bettina, did you want to just quickly put in the chat box maybe if there's a link to the report as well? Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.